Okay. So I'm not sure whether we should start yet. I think we have a small, intimate crowd here tonight, and I welcome you to the panel on Havel. Well, the official name is Havel as Media Practitioner, but we've decided to change the title to Havel and the Fifth Estate. As some of you may know, the Fifth Estate, in English, it means the press. And I think it comes from the time of the French Revolution. And I think the Czech expression for it is sedmá velmoc, the seventh superpower. And so the thinking behind changing the title, at least on my part, was that I don't think that, by the way, I shouldn't introduce myself. My name is Paul Wilson, and I'm Havel's translator. When I use the present tense because there's still an awful lot of his work that remains to be translated. A lot of interesting things that aren't necessarily highly political, but which I think English readers would be interested in. So I still consider myself his translator. I lived in Czechoslovakia for 10 years, from 1967 to 1977, and I had a very intense experience of the Prague Spring when the media became suddenly free and then unfree again. And I've also came back again in 1989. When I was allowed to come back in. I was expelled in 1977, and since then I've been following Havel's work fairly closely and been translating a lot of his speeches when he was president. But the panel that we have here today is a very distinguished panel. Every single person on the panel has had very close ties to Havel and a lot of experience in both working for him, reporting on him, collaborating on him with books, on books, and so I think that one of the things that I'd like to do is to take a look at the very contentious, sometimes, relationship that Havel had with the media. As some of you probably know, Havel's profile abroad was very different than his media profile in the Czech Republic. In the Czech Republic, I think the media and Havel had a love-hate relationship with each other that was rather mutual. The media in the West treated him much more kindly, much more with much more dignity, and I think that so there's this sort of dual vision of Havel, which I hope we can get behind through hearing the personal experiences of our panel members. We've got I'd like to just start by raising the issue of one of Havel's last major pieces of writing, which was a play, as many of you know, called Leaving, Odcházení in Czech. And in this play, the media is presented in a very satirical way. There's the plot of the play, for those of you who don't know it, is the main character is a former head of state who is leaving office and very reluctantly moving out of his villa, which was given to him by the government. And at the same time, there's a reporter who comes in to write an article about his legacy. And this is the sort of obvious agenda, or the visible agenda, but the hidden agenda that the writer has and that the newspaper he's writing for has is they want to destroy that reputation and undermine that legacy. There's a lot of funny stuff, but the media does not come off very well in this last play. And so one of the questions I have, a general question which I will raise and maybe the panel can address, is to what extent is that last very black and bleak view of the media that Havel presented in that play true to his real feelings about the media, or was he a little more positive? There's nothing at all positive about the media in that last play. And in fact, the play implicates the media with the mafia, with corruption, and with a politician whose name is Klein, who is somehow in bed with the corrupt forces that are coming back into power. It's obviously satire, and But I just wonder what our panel thinks about that particular black and bleak view of Havel's view of the media. Havel never wrote very much during his life about the media, and when he did, it was a way of reflecting on questions that were deeper than that. He wrote a very interesting essay in 1975 called Zpívá celá rodina, the whole family is singing, and it's a reflection on the kind of underlying meaning of a very popular Czech television show, which you can actually see on YouTube, and I highly recommend it because it's hilarious. But it's kind of like an early communist version of American Idol. And he found this fascinating and used it as a springboard to reflect on how the media stupefies people and makes them, gives them the illusion that they belong to a real society when in fact they don't. So I guess some other questions which I hope we will get to is the how effective was Havel given his attitudes towards the media? How effective was he as a media person, as a media personality? In my own observation, there's something paradoxical about him because he was a shy person. I don't think he liked the media spotlight, but the media loved him. Wherever he, people were clamoring always to do interviews with him. Whenever I remember talking to some people who were working here in the early 90s in press, shall we call them, press agencies, who said that whenever they slugged a story, whenever they indicated that a story was about Havel, it would immediately sell to all their clients. That that he was a very popular subject. But he did get a lot of bad coverage here, and one of the questions we might raise is, was he partly himself responsible for that bad coverage? In other words, how cleverly did he manage the media? Were there things about the media that he didn't really understand or didn't care to understand? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to raise. It's interesting. I went back to an essay that he wrote in 1992 called Summer Meditations. I think maybe it was 1991 he wrote it, and he doesn't. He talks about his vision for how he would like this country to evolve into a truly functioning democracy with a market economy. And there's no mention of the media in this section of the book at all. It's as though he didn't think or didn't give thought to the role that the media might play in a democracy. And I wonder why that is. It seems I didn't even notice that it was missing at the time I translated the book. But when I go back to it now, it's a kind of a glaring omission. So with that, I will I will introduce our panel. We've got, actually, there's only 4 of us now. There's one person who didn't show up, Pavel Pekáček. I'm very sorry about that, but it gives us more time to talk. I'm going to introduce people alphabetically, and the first person who's on my far right, your far left, is a very distinguished Czech journalist called Karel Hvížďala. And I think more than any other single person, Hvížďala has helped to shape our notion of who Havel was, because his main connection with Havel is in the fact that he did 2 books with Havel in this very interesting fashion. In the 1980s, when Karel was living in exile in Germany, he carried on a long-distance correspondence with Havel, and it was actually called the book was called Long Distance Interrogation, in which is in effect one of the best biography that we have, or the best autobiography that we have of Havel. He was very frank in his answers. The book is very cleverly constructed. That's the work of Mr. Hvížďala, and it's quite revealing. This is a book that came out just after the Velvet Revolution. It was completed long before that. But my translation, I should say, came out in early 1990, and it's the only book I've ever translated that became a New York Times bestseller. It was on the list for about 6 weeks, and that was very pleasant to have happen. I'll tell you just a little bit more about Karel. He also did Havel's presidential memoir, or at least a major part of it, called Prosím stručně in Czech, which is Please Be Brief in English. It's a very thick book, so the title, again, is ironic. This was another book that hasn't sold as well, which I think speaks not to Havel's ability as a writer or Karel's as an interviewer, but it speaks to the fact that actually the interest in this part of the world and in Czechoslovakia has kind of fallen off a little bit in the last few years. I should also say that Karel has published 30 books of such interviews with many of the main figures in Czech intellectual and cultural life. And he's written 20 radio plays, and he's also written 5 books on the media. And at some point, I wanted to just sit down and interview him by myself and ask him a lot of questions about how the Czech media function has changed over the years, especially over the last 20 years. So, without any further ado, please welcome Mr. Karel Hvížďala.
Takže dobrý den, dámy a pánové.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to add a few words to this introduction in order to make it more precise. The long-distance interrogation didn't come into being by correspondence. It was a regular interview. Actually, the letter form was something which we made an attempt at, and we exchanged 3 letters, but we realized that it would last far too long, and we dropped the idea. And in 1984, I sent 60 questions to Václav Havel. He then borrowed a flat at Prague Vinohrady. He locked himself up there with a bottle of whiskey and a carton of cigarettes, and he recorded his replies to those 64 questions. So this was a very funny, a very strange interview with a weird intimacy, because when I listened to it later, I could hear everything, like he's lighting a cigarette, he's shifting a chair, or a sigh, or some abuse, shouting abuse to the silly questions, and some comments about the questions that were aiming at his relationship with Olga and other personal questions. So actually, when we worked on the Prosím stručně book, it was a much more long-distance interview as opposed to the first book, because again, I sent him about 50 to 60 questions, but he took them along with him to Washington, where he sort of huddled himself in the library, and he answered the questions then. What we were talking about since our first meeting back in 1975, when I came to Czechoslovakia in order to ask him about his letter to Gustav Husák, then president, and we were talking about whether there was any hope that things would change in such a way as to publish such important articles on the front page of the dailies, because obviously at that time that was not the case. And then we talked in 2004, when I wrote one of the books about media, How to Think Media, which Paul Wilson referred to. Well, that is just to make the introductory part a bit more accurate. But what has to be said, answering a question when Václav Havel had to deal with media for the first time, that was since the turning of the years 82 to 83, because media saved his life at that time. The funny thing about that was that there was the secret police agent who was sent to the prison to talk to him, and this agent asked him whether he wouldn't want to ask for dismissal, to be discharged from the prison. But upon a consultation with Jiří Dinsby, Havel refused this because the former intention of the secret police was that he would then that this request would then be sent to the Austrian president. Actually, then, by the time he suffered from his third pneumonia in the prison, and he was only treated with aspirin. At that time, his wife learned about his condition, and she wrote a letter to Pavel Kohout in Vienna. And he was fairly good at shaking the conscience of the world's media. And having done this, the Prague media had to react to it, and they brought him to a hospital. And actually, they even decided that they would discharge him from the prison at that time. So he was then brought to one of the Prague's hospital, and for Havel it was one of the most beautiful times of his life, because everybody was taking care for him, and people would be allowed to come and see him, and he was not burdened with all that social responsibility which he was to know later. So this was a very careless and pleasant life. Then, as he told me in the long-distance conversation or long-distance interrogation, actually, oftentimes he was being reproached that all those petitions, all those letters he was writing, he only wrote them in order to be quoted in the papers and to be in the limelights. And he obviously was worried about that and thought about it quite frequently, but he came to a conclusion that it did play a role in the lives of those people who were put under arrest by the communist police for sometimes really trifle offenses, and the Western public learned about that. There were documents which the people managed to smuggle abroad, and it made people think in a broader context about things, especially the people from the gray zone who were particularly interested in such printed materials. And it even had an impact on the establishment, on the power centers in the then Czechoslovakia, who realized that they could not behave just to their liking, that they had to respect some rules, to obey to some rules. That was a very important shift. I think that thanks to all this, the civic society started to germinate. Sometimes this is referred to as segmented pluralism or moral and legal authorities. Those authorities whose authority is not linked to the seat or to the position which they occupy, but who derive their authority from their attitude, from the work, from the life. And Václav Havel was one of these personalities. So thanks to the media, which published the long-distance interrogation in 1985, and which then was translated into 30 languages, including Chinese, Polish, and Russian, and was largely quoted. The book was largely quoted, and actually the book was published even before he was elected president, so this made it possible for the broader public to get to know him. Petr Kovařík had the courage and the stamina to organize the printing and the publishing of the book within 1 week, which was an extraordinary feat. And there weren't even many errors, actually less than you would typically find in a publication today. So all this played a role, and the media helped a lot. People realized actually who was Václav Havel. Let me quote just a little bit of our dialogue for the book, from the book How to Think Media. After November, I was raised to a status of a blessed icon, and I was mythologized. Everyone would write about me in the most reverent way, and it seems that later on journalists sort of started to feel ashamed for that, and they started kicking me in order to take revenge for the former reverence. And sometimes they would even confound the gossip and truth, and suddenly they didn't know how to call me, how to address me, and I seemed to perceive the tendency of erasing me. Based on this experience with media reference, Václav Havel grew increasingly skeptical of late towards not just media, but also the development which took place in them, or was taking place in them, and repeatedly he stressed that he didn't think that just one component of the public space could be changed in a situation where the whole world goes towards more superficiality, where people are either turned into myths or are shamelessly scandalized, and where a deeper insight is missing, where deeper analyses or essays in the media were missing. He told me about the dictate of profit is a very strong dictate, and it is present in all areas of the life, and it can hardly be expected that one part of the public space would be different from the others in this pursuit of profits. He himself was very exacting towards media. And even though he didn't think that such a metamorphosis would be realistic, he still kept talking about it. So whenever we met, our debate turned around media and the role. And that's fairly typical for him, because he always was focused on such issues which seemed are impossible to solve. Everybody would tell him that it was silly to try to find a solution. But Havel was never after collecting records, easy records. He was always after those things which seemed impossible. He would advocate different people that seemed undefendable, and he proved to all around him that the true sense is in digging into things which seem unpredictable, incalculable. And while everybody thinks that there is no sense in that, there is some sense, and it must be proven. And that's a part of his legacy to us, that we have to break the barrier of impossibility. He never reached for a victory, for easy victory, which would come as a result of something, and he never considered himself as a victim. So this is something which is very important, that we should never forget this.
Thanks, Karel. I sometimes wonder whether or not Havel's insistence on giving long answers to television journalists didn't come from his experience with you, because in print you can be as long and detailed as you want, and this is something I think that, so I've heard anyway, Havel did not like giving TV interviews because he couldn't actually go into a question in much depth, and maybe part of that's your fault, I don't know. Our next speaker is Ivo Mathé, who is currently the Dean of, let me get it right here, the Dean of the Academy of the Performing Arts. I think that's the proper way to translate that. And he began life as an economist. Not he began life, he began his career as an economist, but he very, very quickly realized that economy was not satisfying, and he went into he studied at AMU and FAMU, the two of the arts academies in Prague, and then went to work in Czech television on the cultural programming side. And from 1999, and this is an interesting thing. First of all, actually, I want to read you something about, because Ivo's a lot of his life has been spent in television. But I want to read you something that Havel said about television, and then sort of start off with the first question. When Havel was speaking to the students at Harvard in 1995, he said this: "I never fail to be astonished at how much I am at the mercy of television directors and editors, at how much more my public image depends on them more than it does on myself, at how important it is to smile appropriately on television or to choose the right tie, at how television forces me to express my thoughts as sparsely as possible, where are we here? And in witticisms and slogans or sound bites, at how easily my television image can be made to seem different from the real me." Ivo Mathé was the head of Havel's office from 1999 until he left office in 2003. And my first question is, what led him to hire someone with a television background as someone who ran his office? Was there a connection there?
Yeah, Paul, thanks. First of all, I served to Havel as an officer, not as a former Director General of Television.
Yes.
But of course, the experience was certain, and that's the reason I welcome your idea to speak about Havel, not just a contributor or subject or victim of media, but a man who has an opportunity at a certain time to influence the media as a president, theoretically, in the limited power. And first of all, I would like to, for those who are not familiar with the Czech legal system, to explain something. When the new law could be proposed by the government or by the group of deputies. The text goes to the Chamber of Deputies, can be approved by a single majority, then such a law, such an act goes to the Senate. When it's approved by the Senate, goes to the President of the Republic. Havel had the opportunity to sign the act or the veto. Veto is correct, veto. And I would like to speak briefly about one very important act from 2001. It was the middle of the so-called opposition contract. It was an act on TVA, radio broadcasting. They were the media he recognized as most important in that time. He liked the written word, of course, because he was favored in that, but as you mentioned before, with this Harvard lecture, he recognized the power of electronic media a lot, of course. This was just a bit surprising, this law, because in Czech Republic we had a very good broadcasting law approved in 1991, and after not the whole 10 years, a group of deputies came with a new text. There were some deputies from both biggest party, ODS and CSCD. The most important, well-known names are signed there. Mr. Langer, Mrs. Buskova, Mr. Kuchera, Mr. Bendel, from both parties. And why was the reason? The reason was that the existing broadcasters, TV were 2, radio 2, they would like to secure their position on the TV field, the duopoly, for a very long time in advance. They got the licenses in 1993-94 for 12 years, and that was the possibility now in the new act to prolong this licensing for another 12 years, although there are 16 years. It's sure that the law was not written by the deputies, but it was written by the broadcasters. That was the reason some journalist had been written, there's a Lex Železný. Karel, remember that? Lex Železný. He was CEO of the most important, most successful station. Licensee, the boss, or the 4 within the radio, they felt the time of the digitalization comes soon and the broadcaster era will be open for new channels. And they will have new competitors, they will losing the market. On this other side, the deputies, they enjoyed their benefits in the channels, or radios and TV. It was very interesting for them to be sure that after 6 years had a guarantee for another 6 plus 12, 16 to 18 years, and they don't risk that the future is digitalization. This new act passed in the Chamber of Deputies. It was majority of these CCCD deputies and all the communists. The Senate was not against, and President Havel wrote the veto. I have the letter here. Since yet it's not open on the website of Parliament, but it's a very short but very important text. It's a really corpus delicti has how Havel was foresighted in the media. What beyond others, the main reason, wrote that the law enables to prolong the current licensing for another 12 years, what was limiting the entry of new broadcasts on the market and limiting the free competition. And he mentioned the limit of the constitutional rights to conduct business. This was really foresighted. A few years later, this blocked the development of digitalization for a very long time, and no doubt about the political unbalance. Certainly, the time the Havel's veto was outvoted. Not the principles, but in fact, short-term purpose was more important for the parties. Between the politicians and media, the confidential deal won. This is really clear example of opposition contract policy, and not just at the time. It was just one of few Havel's veto. This was extraordinarily important concerning not just media. He was very saving the vetoes. I remember well that during his 10 years of presidency, he vetoes just 25 acts. To compare with President Klaus, he's now 9.5 years, and he signed veto by 55 acts yet. Again, I would like to repeat that in that case was Václav Havel very foresighted, and he knew more about the electronic media than we can imagine yet. Yeah.
Not me. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know, probably some people in the audience have already seen this film, and I'm sure you've seen it, the film called Citizen Havel, Občan Havel.
Yeah.
There's a scene in there, and I think you're in the scene, when you're discussing, Havel is discussing how to explain to the public that he sold Lucerna to Chemopol, this company that had a somewhat shady background. And all of the advisors were advising him on how he would like to explain it. And he simply said, look, you know, everyone's going to understand. It's a perfectly logical thing to do. And you were all trying to get him to back off. How did that work out? I mean,
That's the first time opportunity to explain my feeling from that time. Because it was camera inside, and I'm sure Havel felt the camera all the time during the Citizen Havel,
yeah.
Except that moment, that I don't know, 2 minutes or 3 minutes,
right.
He forgot the camera present.
The camera was there. Yes, because he was very, very frank.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway. So thank you so much for that contribution. And I will now go on to our next panelist, Jolien Negle, who lives in a part of the world that I'm not sure I'd want to live in. He's a member of the UN. He's actually the political director of the United Nations mission in Kosovo, and he lives in Kosovo. But he has a very long background with this country. He came here in the 1980s, and it's an amazing thing, but he was accredited as a correspondent, I believe, for the Voice of America. He was here officially for the Voice of America, which doesn't really square with my notion of how tight the government then controlled journalists. And he's lived here for a long time. I think you left in 2003. So he speaks Czech. Tonight he's going to speak English, but he interviewed Havel many times and covered the whole evolution of the kind of tail end, I would say, or the middle to the end of the Czech dissident movement, which was in the 1980s, something I didn't experience myself because they threw me out, but I gather it was a very different experience from the 1970s. He's interviewed Havel over the years, both as a dissident and as president. And so I look forward to his perspective on this. Jolien.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, I will focus primarily on Václav Havel's relationship to Czech and Slovak language broadcasters from abroad. His relationship with other journalists was somewhat different. My first interview was in, I believe, 1985. He still hadn't moved into the flat on the embankment. He was living in Prague 6. It was a conspiratorial meeting because he was generally under surveillance. I was generally under surveillance, and we had to meet without our minders noticing. And so it was agreed to meet through Ivan Havel. We met at Zdeněk Urbanek's place on a Sunday morning while Václav Havel went out for, I don't know, rolls and milk or something, and stopped on the way back to see Zdeněk, and I was sitting in the kitchen and prepared and asked for an interview on his having been, or about to have been, awarded the Erasmus of Rotterdam Prize. This was perceived as a substitute for getting the Nobel Literature Prize, which he wasn't going to get. I don't remember the background. He took it frightfully seriously. He really had to think through what he was going to say so that he could get the message out on the one hand and not risk paying a price by straying from the line and going to political. So he sat down and really thought through very carefully what he wanted to say, and he did keep it brief because he understood the power of radio better than he understood television, I think, and I'll get to that later. Subsequent interviews were easier after he moved to the embankment. One still had to pass sometimes a policeman downstairs or even out on the street. There were provocations by police, both uniform and plain clothes on occasion. And then one still had to get past the front door, depending on who answered. And Olga Havlova generally said that Vašek has to write now, and he really doesn't have time to see journalists. But once he found out that it was the Voice of America, entry was granted, and he was always willing to give an interview and also to give his opinion on our broadcasts, and why can't we possibly always have Ivan Medic's reports and reports on the dissident movement at the same time, so he doesn't have to sit through religious reporting from Slovakia and sports reporting by Pavel Pecháček, etc. I don't know if you really understood that the point of tucking it in there was to make sure that all our 2 or 3 million regular listeners in this country would hear his things amid the sports, which some people thought was the most important, or the religious reporting or whatever. And he was an avid listener, but obviously he didn't want to lose an hour every night at 9 with the VOA, and that's understandable, but we had not one listener, but 2 or 3 million. I'll give you a few anecdotes and a bit of analysis. There was only one other mild conspiracy. I engaged with him when he was about to have the premiere of another play in Vienna, Largo Desolato, and I had tickets to the premiere, but I wanted to read it in the original. My German was good enough, but I really wanted to know what he said, and I wanted to interview him about it. And he said, look, I only have one copy. I'll lend it to you, but you can't let it out of your sight, and it has to be back here in 24 hours. And so I wandered around Prague for 24 hours with this thing in my, I don't remember, under my arm or in my backpack, and I read it and enjoyed it. And it was a remarkably accurate description of his early post-prison years, living in fear of the police, his family and his friends for various reasons. And he gave me a good interview on that. 1988 and 89 obviously were very special years. There were a number of significant events that for the media were unusual. There was a historians conference that he organized in Prague in November 88. He invited Karel Schwarzenberg from Vienna and various historians from around Europe to come. The original venue suddenly became unavailable, and things moved to a hotel behind the Obecní dům. And the journalists sat in one part of the restaurant, and the conference took place in a lower part of the restaurant. We just sort of watched the proceedings, and as soon as he banged the gavel to formally open the meeting, the STB came in and carried him off. And this was one of the few times, perhaps the only time, where we actually were able to witness such a detention of Václav Havel. And ORF, the Austrian radio and TV, actually recorded him being escorted out. German television was quick to put their camera down when asked to by the police. October 88, he went into hiding around the 28th, knowing that otherwise he would be picked up. And on the night of the 28th, there was a premiere on the outskirts of Prague of a play that he had written but was being performed anonymously. Everyone in the crowd, or almost everyone, knew that he had written. I didn't. I believed the lies I'd been told. And it was very good and it was very shocking. And Olga was there and asked me if I knew where her husband was. 89. In January, he was detained. In March, he went on trial. The detention was essentially for laying flowers in Wenceslas Square at the site of Jan Palach's self-immolation. And the STB wisely, they decided to have two trials, one of, I believe, 7 dissidents in one courthouse on Karlovo náměstí and another with Havel elsewhere. They were simultaneous. That broke up the journalists into 2 groups. And on the 17th of May, when he was released halfway through his sentence, I interviewed him in his flat, and he made it very clear in the interview that the world had changed considerably since January, in his view, based on A, the treatment he received in jail, and B, what was being said and written about him, the development of několik věd and other sort of civil society movements, and he was aware the day he came out just how much had changed. I was here less in the second half of '89, but I was here from the 19th of November onwards, and he conducted the demonstrations from the 20th onwards extremely well. And on the 20th, Monday the 20th of November, he held his first and last news conference in his flat, in his study. It was a bit of a circus. The place was packed. There were journalists, cameramen standing on the furniture, on chairs, to get a better view. He started in English, but eventually brought in Mrs. Rita Klimová to interpret. And he said a number of interesting things. The most significant was that he'd rather be kingmaker than king. 6 weeks later, he was elected unanimously president in the Vladislavsky Sál at the castle. Once president, things were very well stage managed, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Michal Žantovský. He chose to make his first trip abroad to the 2 Germanys on the first working day in the presidency, and went to East Berlin and Munich. And he wanted it to be low-key, and I remember him being rather irritated when the plane pulled up in Munich to a red carpet, and Chancellor Kohl, President von Weizsäcker, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher were all standing down waiting. And he said, that's not what we expected or asked for. We made it absolutely clear what we wanted. And in the subsequent weeks and months, as he traveled around to Reykjavik, Ottawa, Toronto, Washington, New York, Moscow, London, etc., things were generally well choreographed. Yes, there were hiccups. Yes, there was some bad organization here and there. The plane was delayed an hour from departing from Andrews Air Force Base because no one had bothered to bring the Havel's luggage. And all of this was played out in front of the media, which reveled in it and wrote about it. There were regular, but increasingly less regular, news conferences. And at some point in the spring of 1990, the castle and the media reached a certain breaking point. I believe it was in the spring, but it might have been later in 1990, when there was a news conference about the castle, and there were a variety of architects and experts invited, and it became much too technical and much too old school. And there was a lot of loud complaining at the end, and there was never another news conference like that. Essentially, with the foreign media, his relationship stayed positive through his first, and I would even say much of his Czechoslovak presidency, plus much of his first term as Czech president. Things went sour, and what you see in Odcházení is a reflection of 97 and onwards. There was a different Václav Havel. It was a different media, because the foreign media, after the Velvet Divorce, largely packed up and left if they had anywhere else to go. Right. And so you didn't have this large gaggle of foreign journalists eager to cover his every breath. I was the head of the Foreign Journalists Association in Prague for several years in 93, 94, if I'm not mistaken. We had a meeting with him, a sort of a beseda, in a French cafe in Havelska that's still there, the day before Olga died. And we were almost surprised that he didn't cancel out, and he was not in great shape, and this was in the morning, and he had a couple of stiff drinks, rum, I believe it was, along with his tea. But he sat there and he talked, and he was remarkably open, if slightly uncomfortable. He also met with the media at the time. I don't remember if it was just before or just after he announced that he was resigning. I suspect it was just before, in Lani. And this was both domestic and foreign media. It was a barbecue, and he was extremely relaxed, open, and joking with the journalists. And he asked me what I thought of Clinton. He said he was very worried that Clinton would win the elections against his dear friend George Bush Sr. And I said that he had nothing to worry about, that if he were an American, he would certainly be voting for Clinton and not for Bush. And then after the breakup, things became different. He was ever more wrapped up, I think, in his feud with Václav Klaus. And after his illnesses and his remarriage, or his second marriage, his behavior changed somewhat. He had, in the summer of 97, I believe, a news conference in the Jižní Zahrada, where he showed up with Dagmar and two dogs, and they were in sunglasses, and it was a scene out of Odcházení. It was life imitating art that was going to imitate life. It was rather bizarre. I was very sorry I hadn't brought a camera, but I'm sure someone has taken a few pictures. The image said all the wrong things, and it only, I think, contributed to a certain alienation that had been growing for some time between the media and Havel. In the meantime, of course, despite Havel's pleas to Congress and to Pavel Pecháček and to anyone who would listen not to cut back on foreign language radio broadcasts in Czech and Slovak, the inevitable happened. He said, obviously, it's not just you have to continue, you have to reshape these broadcasts, but there's a lot to be learned because our journalists still don't have a clue. Right. So that's it. I'm sure I left out a few gems, but that was the relationship as I saw it from my vantage point.
I heard actually that it was Havel who actually asked Radio Free Europe to set up headquarters in Prague.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's true. Yeah.
So he actually, that seemed like a good idea. Did it work out well?
It did and it didn't. It worked out. First, the Czech language service set up initially. And the main news, the main body of RFERL came in 95. and was given the Federal Assembly building, which they used until about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. It worked, but in the meantime, the Czech service became superfluous. The Slovak service stayed on a good deal longer. That was cut down, and then gradually many of the other services were cut down, and the government here was no longer willing to allow the use of RFERL, the use of the Federal Parliament building. It wasn't an ideal building for this purpose. There was a tremendous amount of wasted space, kubatura, that just, you know, it was like having a radio station in this room. I mean, it's just a waste.
Right. Jolyon, thanks a lot. You've made me actually think about one of the anecdotes that you told about the secret meeting, or the not so secret meeting of historians. I think we've just heard a story about the embryo of Forum 2000. I mean, I think, you know, that was the kind of thing that he loved to do. He loved to bring people together and shoot the breeze, as it were. Also, you made me think about an aspect of his charm was that he was very natural, I think, with the media, and sometimes it worked, and as you described, sometimes it didn't work. But I think there was something, he was different from any other leader, and this is always attractive to the media. They love the eccentric, if you like. Our next speaker and final speaker, and he's last only because his name starts with Z, or Je, which is even further down the alphabet in Czech. The Honorable Michael Žantovský, who is now, for the time being at least, the ambassador to Great Britain. I say for the time being because apparently the political situation here is in flux, and one never knows how long these things will last. I have a story to tell about Michael. When I was here in 1989, I think it was, or maybe the early 1990, covering the aftermath of the Velvet Revolution, I was at a press conference in the castle, and I believe by that time you were the press secretary or the spokesman. Both. And I remember him being asked a rather delicate question by one of the journalists, and this gleam came into your eye, and you said, "No comment." And you said it as though you just swallowed, the cat had swallowed the canary. It was, you were so delighted to be able to say that. And I think that was actually having press conferences was something quite new in those days. But you went on to other things, and I want to tell you something a little bit about the background of Michael. You may not know. He studied psychology. And worked for a while in Bohunice, which is a place where sometimes people who were in trouble with the regime went to get away from that trouble. And he's also he's a man of many parts. He's a translator, and he's translated an amazing list of well-known Western writers. And I'll just read you some of the names: James Baldwin, E.L. Doctorow. He's translated Nadine Gordimer, Joseph Heller. I don't think you translated Catch-22 was another one, was it?
No, I was too young for that.
Too young for, okay.
It was Good as Gold. And
somebody else translated that who was working as a stoker on Wenceslas Square. Anyway, and Norman Mailer, of all people, Toni Morrison, and Tom Stoppard. I believe that you were a stringer for a while for Reuters in Prague, was that right?
I was the Prague correspondent for Reuters.
Right, okay, the Prague correspondent. Maybe stringer's too low down the list.
Well, I started as a stringer.
Okay.
You know.
And I find this fascinating. He's an expert in Woody Allen, and has written a book or a monograph or whatever you want to call it on Woody Allen and his humor. And this is something that happened in the 1980s, I believe, when life wasn't all that much fun here. When he finished as press attaché for Havel, he went to the United States, to Washington as the ambassador to Washington, and then came back and got mixed up in politics. politics and became, I believe, the leader of the Civic Democratic Alliance for a while and a member of the Senate for that party from 1997 until 2003. And then after that, I remember you went to Israel, I believe, as ambassador, and I think, I have to tell this story too, you were offered a job as ambassador to Ottawa, my country, Canada, and you said that was the last place in the world you wanted to go. And I can believe you. It's cold and maybe a bit boring, certainly more boring than Tel Aviv. And the only other thing that I'll add is that Michael is writing a book on Havel right now, so I would like to hear what he has to say. Michael, welcome, Michael.
Well,
Žantovský.
thank you, Paul, for a very gracious introduction. I only have to correct one little bit,
Please.
because I have the utmost respect for the government and the people of Canada, and actually I like Canada. I went to school there, and they treated me very nicely.
The people of Canada can take a joke. It's all right.
It was my wife who said, "I'm not going, it's cold." So, you know, I apologize to my wife that I'm blaming it on her, but that's actually the way it was. Now, I spent 2.5 years as Havel's spokesman and press secretary, and you would say director of communications or whatever. And there's no question that, you know, from a standard point of view, he was a difficult customer as far as the media are concerned. And I will try to explain the reasons why, because in my mind it says something about Havel as a person, and it also says something about the nature of media. It's not that he was not a great communicator in the same way that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator, but at the same time he was very effective at communicating, and actually he's been communicating or had been communicating for most of his life and got his message across quite nicely. Thank you. It was that he had a somewhat different approach. And one part of the approach was that he tried, and when he became president, tried somewhat unrealistically to control the channel of communication when he had a chance. And I think that stemmed from two factors. One was that during the communist era, as many of us remember, you know, the official press and the government and the police would twist everything that you say to unrecognition, and he had a very traumatic experience in 1977 when he was first in jail, and he petitioned for release from jail the public prosecutor, and he pledged in a very nice and vague language to refrain from activities that could be construed as criminal, which the government immediately translated and published the next day in the Rudé Právo, in the Communist Party paper, as a pledge to refrain from all political activities, which was something Havel never promised. So he tried to control the channel, and there are numerous instances of this, and one of them is the story of how Charter 77 was publicized abroad, and its existence was revealed, and Václav Havel, together with Pavel Kohout, conspired in a very detailed way to arrange, and if there are journalists here, they know how difficult it is to achieve something like that, to have the charter and the story about the charter published the same day that they mailed the petition to the authorities in 6 or 7 of the largest papers in Europe and in North America, in the New York Times, in Le Monde, in Frankfurter Allgemeine, and in a couple of other papers. And so they went through a friendly German journalist. He managed to get all the editors to agree on a time of the publication. No one would have the scoop, etc., etc. In the end, it didn't quite work out that way because they forgot that Le Monde is an evening paper, so it did come out 12 hours earlier, which was just as well, because by the time Havel and Vaculík were already in jail, and the story, the early revelation of the story helped them quite a lot. But that was only one of the reasons he tried to control the channel of the communication. The other was that he was by nature, by profession, by vocation, he was a writer. And as a writer, he did not only think about the content of the message, but also about the shape of the message and the structure of the message and the texture of the message. And he simply hated it when journalists were trying to edit him, interpret him, rephrase him, because he felt that, you know, the original phrase, the original structure, the original texture was the right one. And some of this also comes out, Karel mentioned it in the beginning, in the interview books that he published. He will tell you much more about it than I do, but you know, the books that came out as Disturbing the Peace and To the Castle and Back, they are the titles in English, but also the Summer Meditations, you know, were not written or recorded in the form they came out. I mean, it's more obvious with To the Castle and Back than with Disturbing the Peace, but Havel revised the whole text, edit the diaries from the castle, edit his notes from the trip to Washington, and then he worked on the structure. He added repetitions, he added emphasis, etc., etc. And this was his way to get the message across. The same thing with Summer Meditations. The Summer Meditations, in fact, was a book that was never really written. It was recorded as a series of tapes in talks at Hradeček in late 1991 between Havel and Pavel Tigrit and yours truly. And then Havel collected the tapes and rewrote the tapes into what we know today as Summer Meditations. Also a very typical way for him to handle the channel. On the other hand, he was completely alien to you know, the forms of manipulating the press that are natural to any politician who becomes something. I mean, the idea of a spin or the idea of a soundbite was as foreign to him as the idea of a desert is to an Eskimo. He completely did not. And he felt that it was limiting him in a very, very unnatural way. On picture media, it was even more complicated because he absolutely refused to change his usual demeanor for the camera, and he drove some communicators and some journalists to despair when he came to Washington in February 1990 to give the famous address to the joint session of the US Congress. Madeleine Albright, who was helping us as our guru around the town and as our advisor and other things as well, she hired or brought in a speech coach for Havel to help him with the delivery, and he was a very respected speech coach who advised a number of American presidents, etc., etc. So he knew his job, and he started with Havel and let him read half a page of the speech, and Havel started to fast, and he said, no. You have to look here, here's the camera, and here are some of the senators and some of the Congress, and then you have to look that there are the other part of the senators and the congressmen, and not look at the floor again. And Havel, started again looking at the floor. After about 15 minutes of this, the speech coach said, the man, could not address, the meeting of the local Parents-Teacher Association, let alone a meeting of the joint session of the US Congress. Well, the next day Havel went and delivered the speech, got 17 standing ovations, and the rest, as they say, is history. One of the most famous, and I will not name her, US talk show hosts came to Prague to interview Havel for the primetime television talk show she anchored, and so they set up the cameras, started after the fast exchange. She said, stop, you must look at me. Again, started, Havel would not look at her, and she said, the man is not looking at me, what? And I said, look, the man, as you say, spent the last 10 years being interrogated and jailed by the authorities and the police, and the first thing you don't do when you're interviewed by the police is look them in the eye. This gives a lot away. He's accustomed to doing this. So she tried again, and after 5 minutes she said, well, the man does not show any emotions. And how come he doesn't show any emotions? And I said, by that time I was a little upset. So I said, maybe he doesn't feel any emotions. And she did the interview, but stormed out of the castle, never said goodbye, etc., etc. And this is the second part of why I think that Havel was not a media communicator in the usual sense, and it was simply his insistence at staying himself. He defended his identity in more fiercely than any other man I've ever known. It had to do in part with the concept of living in truth. So he would not self-promote himself. He would not market himself. He would not even, make an attempt at any obvious self-representation. So the best parts of Havel and the media are those forms and those structures that are free-flowing, not Q&A, in long halls of him just talking or of just behaving. And this you can see in some of the documentary films, in Pavel Koutecky's film, who followed him for years around with camera, in Petr Jančárek's films, etc., etc. And this is in a way a paradox, because Havel, after the fast moments, most of us, how most of us are with cameras. When there's a camera in the room, we stop behaving naturally and start behaving like idiots. Havel was different. I mean, he behaved the same way with camera or without it, and I think Ivo, that maybe is also the explanation why you can, and we've edited some of them out, but why you can, see on camera even some very intimate and some very mildly maybe embarrassing exchanges, but he simply would not change for the camera. So his talks from Lani, that was the radio show we started recording, I think, in March or April 1990. Many people think it's the inspiration was Masaryk's and Čapek's talks with TGM. No, the inspiration was the Roosevelt's fireside chats that he was recording during the war, and it was not a very structured program which went on air every Sunday after lunch, and in which Havel more or less recapitulated the events of the week and addressed some of the pressing issues. And for me, the movies and the talks from Lani are Havel at his best, a genuine article, and what you see is what you get, and that was Václav Havel.
Thank you, Michael. We only have about 10 minutes left. Jolene, you have a quick comment, but I want to leave some time for anyone who has a question from the audience,
Okay.
so I'll let you.
A couple of very quick comments. He was a playwright, he was a choreographer to a certain extent. He did say at a news conference the end of February, 2 weeks before President von Weizsäcker came here on the 15th of March 1990, which was the 51st anniversary of the first German arrival in Prague. And I'll quote this in Czech. Já jsem takovým přítelem symbolů v politice, což ti politici, kteří jsou takovými celoživotními profesionálními politiky, moc ten smysl nemají. Chybí jim zkušenost, umění a divadla. That says a lot about his attitude. Secondly, he did do some spin. At a Castle news conference, on the 24th of May, so this must have been shortly before the elections, the first free elections, he came clean on his STB file. He took the initiative. It wasn't that it came out first and then he had to respond, which showed some courage, and it wasn't a scandal as a result.
That's not spin, that's just smart.
That's smart, but it's also spin because no one else had the file.
That's right.
And it was his accounting of what was in there, and it went unchallenged to my knowledge.
Right.
Third, on television. His first appearance, if I'm not mistaken, was on Večerník sometime towards the end of November 89, and it was an embarrassment.
Somewhat later. It was somewhat later.
It might have been early December, but it was certainly during the revolution, and suddenly he was talking about the need to apologize to Germany for the expulsion. He was asked about his attitude towards socialism, and he had nothing against socialism as such, etc. He didn't suffer from it, but it was an image, the visual image was much stronger, luckily, than the content of what he said. And the visual image wasn't pretty, but it showed him more as a human. I mean, he was sort of curled up, not quite fetal style, in front of the camera and stuttering and really not comfortable with the situation. But as a result, people had sympathy for him and didn't focus quite as much as they would have otherwise on what he said.
He didn't have a spokesman then.
But isn't that the amazing thing, that despite all these flaws, he was still he was still attractive to the media. They loved him. But I want to go to the audience now to see if there's some questions. I don't know whether, do you have a microphone that we can use? Are there any questions that you want to direct to somebody in the audience? I can't see you very well because of these lights, but
There's someone.
there's someone? Okay. Please keep your questions brief. Prosím stručně.
Dobrý večer. Já se tady
Good evening. My apologies for speaking Czech. My name is Ondřej Ryboň, and I'm a student of Central European Studies in Opava. I want to ask about the problematic relationship between Václav Havel and Slovaks. He was a Czechoslovak president, and when the federation went apart, the perception of Havel was different on the side of the Czechs and of the Slovaks. So I wonder to what extent his media picture changed in Slovakia after 1918, and how do they perceive him today? Bill,
First, some people criticize Václav Havel for Petr Pithard, for example, in his book, for not taking the very first trip abroad to Slovakia. Well, it's a contradiction in terms. Slovakia was not abroad at the time, and Havel did go to Bratislava and to Košice before he was elected president, I think on the 19th or so of December. He does speak in the very first important speech, in the New Year's speech of 1990, about the importance to find a genuine expression of the relationship between the two nations in the federation, which suggests that he was aware that this was one of the very important issue already at that very early stage. The next key moment, which is often held against him, was his decision to cease exporting armaments to countries with authoritarian regimes and civil wars and etc., which meant most of the countries Czechoslovakia exported weapons to, because we didn't export any weapons to democratic countries. We exported all of them to the other communist countries and to third world countries in Africa and Asia. And because most of the heavy armaments industry at that time was in Slovakia, it meant that number of the factories closed down or had to reduce employment, etc. People lost their jobs. And on this, I think the criticism is half true. I think we did a poor job of communicating the importance of this to the population, and also of explaining that it would have happened regardless, no matter what we did, because all the defense industries all around Europe, all around the Soviet bloc, took a big hit with the end of the Cold War. The market basically collapsed, and there was no way we could have kept the mostly Warsaw Pact oriented defense industry in the volume, in the size we had. And then it went largely downhill from then on, and there's another element of this which I'm in two minds about, And that was the role played by our friends, our counterparts, so to speak, in the Public Against Violence, which was the equivalent of the Civic Forum in Slovakia, when the first expressions of nationalist sentiment began to be voiced in Slovakia, and sometimes very ugly, but on the margin of the Slovak society. They felt this was threatening the developments in Slovakia, and in the end they decided to try to steal the thunder from the nationalists, and for the first election in June 1990 they formulated a very nice program, which was election platform, which was called the Chance for Slovakia. And it was not by any chalk of imagination a radical nationalist program, but it was a program not about Czechoslovakia, not about the reforms needed. It was primarily about Slovakia. Add to this the decision, which is mysterious to me to this day, of the Federal Assembly in putting into a law a bill on political parties, which basically made it impossible to have federal political parties that would be in both sides of the country, because you could only register a party with the Ministry of Interior in the Czech Republic or with the Ministry of Interior with Slovakia, but you could not register a party with the federal ministry.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I don't think we have time for the whole story, but you ask about, you know, what were the elements that started making this happen. So these are the few I can think of.
I actually happen to agree with you that.
If I may add something, and don't forget, please, he was the man who helped Slovakia to enter NATO and European Union a lot, and it was appreciated by the Slovak media, really.
Yes. Today he's well respected in Slovakia.
But I'm speaking that it was the end of the 90s, no?
Yeah.
But there was one other element, and that was he did get even with the nationalists in the end, in that simultaneous with the Slovak National Council, Slovak Parliament's declaration on sovereignty, he announced his resignation, stole the thunder, captured the headlines, and they were wiped off the front page.
92.
So we have a question here. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid, because we're just on 7:30.
Marek Pecivol, novinář, já si dovolím taky mluvit česky.
I would take the liberty of speaking Czech too. I was a correspondent of various media in Poland, in Austria, and in Germany for more than 10 years, and I realized that the most important thing when people from Czechoslovakia disagreed disagreed with President Havel was his attitude towards Germany and some issues from the past where he addressed apologies to the former Czechoslovak German-speaking citizens. This would be a question to Mr. Žantovský and perhaps Mr. Mathé. How did he accept the fact that the Czech population didn't see him in the eyes with this? Já si myslím, že to opravdu
Not really relevant to the topic of this panel. It's not about media. It's about what we did with Germany and with the past.
Right,
and,
right.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
So I would leave it for another panel.
It's a very important question.
I agree with Michael, and I'm not sure about the public opinion you mentioned. Not sure about it.
Right.
It's not such a research exists.
I think that there's a gala dinner soon, and I'd just like to wrap it up by thanking our panel for the very interesting contributions. I've certainly myself learned an awful lot, and I might want to finish with one quick story. In preparing for moderating this panel, I talked to some other Havel employees about Havel and the media, and from one of them I heard a very interesting story that illustrates a rather charming aspect of Havel's personality, which is his kind of innocence about things. This involved the visit of Bill Clinton to Czechoslovakia, and Havel and some of his staff roared out to the airport in the limousines, and Airport 1 landed. It's a huge plane, and normally I gather in situations like this, the first person to leave the plane is the person who's visiting, making the official visit, the president, the queen, whoever it happens to be. In this case, Havel was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The red carpet was rolled out. The door opens up. And instead of Bill Clinton, about 200 media people come down the stairs and set up their cameras. And Havel is standing around waiting for Bill Clinton to arrive. And finally, after only when the media was completely set up, did he then make his exit from the plane. And Havel turned to his advisor and said, "No, ta media to je skutečně ta sedmá velmoc. The media is definitely the fifth estate, or definitely the seventh, great power." That his impression was that the media were running the show, whereas in actual fact it would have been Clinton who organized the whole thing, or his people. So, thank you very, very much for coming and listening to this. I hope it's been enlightening in some ways. And I also thank the organizers for the opportunity to do this. And have a great evening. Thanks.